Hello C# students. This week what we're going to cover is entity framework. So if you go to Canvas, you'll see in the learning module there's a PowerPoint presentation which is chapter 24 in our C# book in your Maroc textbook for entity framework. So the next two lectures, the first lecture is going to cover more how to structure your tables and insert your entities into your Visual Studio project. And then next week's lectures will cover how to do that using stored procedures. So we can actually pass parameters into our SQL and get information out of our SQL tables using stored procedures. If you've already taken the database courses, it will make a little bit of sense. If you have not, we'll cover it next week, stored procedures. So I'm going to try to cover this at a level where you don't need a lot of SQL Server knowledge or background. So these next two lectures are bonus lectures in the sense that we're not going to have any specific assignments where we need to use Entity Framework, but it is very important to know, and it's very important to know how to use, because if you do get a co-op using .NET, you're going to have a pretty good chance that they're going to ask you if you ever used Entity Framework. I know it's one of our interview questions at Great American Insurance, if you've ever used Entity Framework, or if you've ever used any sort of ORM or object relational mapper. One of them in Java that's pretty popular as well is Hibernate. So whenever you go on to take the Enterprise Java course, you'll probably use some sort of ORM to get objects out of the database. And one of those ORMs is called Hibernate. So the sister to that, the .NET equivalent, since it is Microsoft, there's really only one. Whereas Java, there's kind of multiple since it's open source, but Microsoft, there's really only one to use, and that's Entity Framework. So depending on if you are using .NET Framework, which we are for this course, for this particular course, or if you're using .NET Core, which you'll use for your web server application development course when you go on to take that further on in the software track, you'll have two different versions of Entity Framework as well. So the version we use here is called Entity Framework. It's more of the standard edition. It was the edition that we'll use for the standard version of .NET. And then there's also Entity Framework Core, which goes hand in hand with .NET Core, its implementation. So here we'll use the standard version of Entity Framework, and then when you take the web server application development class, you'll use Entity Framework Core. So you'll get both flavors of Entity Framework during your tenure here at UC. And both of them are very widely used in the industry. It's very common. These are very, very common in the .NET world. So that being said, I'm just going to hit a few high points in this PowerPoint, and then we'll move on to the Visual Studio aspect and get this working in a Visual Studio project. So how to use Entity Framework. So essentially Entity Framework is just a layer between the database and our application. So it kind of wraps, if you're familiar with the term wrap, it somewhat wraps ADO.NET, which is the libraries that we used in our previous lecture for the product maintenance application. So we used ADO.NET. We formatted our inserts and our updates and our deletes. So Entity Framework can actually do that for us without having to put the SQL actually into our code. So we're going to create an entity data model, and then we're going to use Entity Framework to interface with that entity data model and put things into our database and actually map things to methods for us to use. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit further in the PowerPoint here. So here's kind of what I was talking about at a high level. This this chart is even a little bit confusing, but essentially you have your database server here. So we're going to have our database management system, which is SQL Server in our instance, and it's going to talk to ADO.NET, which is, remember, that underlying SQL code to get that data from our database, and then Entity Framework is going to be our interface and actually generate that ADO.NET code for us, and then it's going to then map that to our entity data model, which we'll see in Visual Studio here in a second. So again, Entity Framework provides a layer between the database and our application. It provides us the objects for us to use, and then it can also track changes for submitting it to the database. So ways to query, we're going to use LINQ. We'll cover LINQ more in a couple more lectures after Entity Framework. It's actually the last lecture before your final project. LINQ is a very strong tool used in .NET to query. So essentially it's very SQL-like, where you can select things from a data set, you can filter, and you can create new objects out of it as well, all with the IEnumerable interface. So this is the wizard that we're going to use. You can read through this yourself, but we're also going to go through the wizard in Visual Studio. So notice here in this step it says which version of Entity Framework do you want to use. So Entity Framework version 6 point whatever, Entity Framework version 5. So these are all versions in the Entity Framework Standard Edition, or the regular version of Entity Framework. So this isn't core, this is strictly the standard version of Entity Framework. It goes up to version 6, and Entity Framework Core, I believe, is version 2 right now. It might have came out with 3 when they came out with .NET Core 3.1, I'm not sure. So here's our tables. We can see once we put in the connection string, it'll show us all of the tables that are available to us. It can also show us the stored procedures and views as well, which we'll cover next week. And then it gives you a conceptual model of what our tables look like in Visual Studio. So it'll show you all of the columns to your table, if there's any sort of relationship to another table. So this has a one-to-many relationship between customers and invoices. So a customer can have multiple invoices, but an invoice can only contain one customer. So the rest of this you can read on your own. That's all I wanted to cover in this. I didn't want to spend too much time in this PowerPoint. The majority of this video I wanted spent in Visual Studio, so I'm going to go ahead and go over here to Visual Studio. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new project while I'm over here. It's going to be a classic desktop application. It's going to be a Windows Form application. I'm going to name it, where do I want to put it? I'll just leave it here for now. I'm going to call this Entity Framework Demo. It's going to use .NET Framework 4.6.2. I want to go ahead and save this in case I ever need to go out and get it again. Okay. I want to go ahead and click OK. That already exists, so I must have already done this before. So I'm going to call it Entity Framework Demo 2. Okay. Alright, so now we have a project. I'm going to go over, I already have a version of SQL Server installed over here. So I have a database already set up that I did for the other demo I did. So I have a table, I have a users table. So what I'm going to be demonstrating is we have an application and we need to have users, username and passwords for the users that are trying to log in to our application. So I can right click here, I can select the top 1,000 rows, and then I made a lot of users that are essentially me. But I'm going to go ahead and delete this table, and I'll remake it, and just to go through step by step how to create the table and how to create the users. I'm also going to delete this stored procedure, as we'll create this later as well. Let's go ahead and delete that. Alright, so now all I have is an empty database that I call desktop, very poorly named. So it's essentially the database that I put on my desktop computer strictly for the purpose of making these videos. I'm going to go down to tables and create a new table. Let's not do it that way. Let's actually go to new query. And I actually saved the query that I used to create that table over here in my notepad file. So use desktop, which is my database over here on the left. It's the database name. I want to create a table. The schema is going to be database owner.users. The columns will be their ID, so it's going to be an identity column, the username, password, and then maybe say if it's a website, did they cancel or something from the website, maybe they deleted their profile or something, which is a date time. So what date they canceled their subscription on our website. So I'm going to go ahead and F5 that. Maybe I'll run it, execute. Alright, so it executed successfully. So now I should be able to see a table over here, users. Refresh. There's my users table. I'm going to go ahead and exit out of here, go to my users table. There's the columns again. And then I can actually go here and insert. I'm going to edit the top 200 rows. So I'm actually going to insert the ID. I'm going to leave the ID null. Username, I'm going to have it my email. I'm going to have a password, which you should never save your password as plain text, but here we go. And the cancel date I'm going to leave as null. So notice it made an ID for me. And my username, my password is just password, and cancel date is null for now, so I'm an active user on our website, on whatever website I'm making, or even this Windows desktop application. So if I go back to Visual Studio here, I'm going to go here, and what I'm actually going to make is a new project. So I'm going to add a new project to this Entity Framework demonstration, and it's going to be Entity Framework Demo 2.database. So this is going to encapsulate the connection to our database and all of the things we need to do to interact with our database. This is going to be a class library. It's not going to be a Windows Form app. It's going to be a class library. Let's hit OK. And now we have a new class library over here. I'm going to delete this class 1 as we won't use it. Here we have our form. And I'm actually going to make a new class here. Much like our product maintenance application, I'm going to have a static class that will then talk to my database from my Windows Form application. So it's almost going to be somewhat of a proxy or a service layer to my database. So I'm going to call this users db proxy.cs. I'm going to go ahead and make it public. And I'll go ahead and make a new class here. And I'll call it users DAO. So this is their user data access object. I'll go ahead and make this one public as well. So now in this project, in my database project, what I want to do is add a new item. In that new item, I'm going to go to the data portion, and I want to use the ADO.NET entity data model. And I'm going to call it users since it's my users. I'm just going to call it desktop since it's the desktop database. And click add. And then from there, it should start taking us through the wizard that we saw in our PowerPoint. So it's going to be from a database. So I'll double click that. And notice my connection string is already here to my desktop. So if you have a version of SQL Server running locally, you can connect to it here. And then type in the server instance here, and then it should connect via Windows authentication to that instance in your SQL Server. So I already have that connection, and notice it shows up my connection string here already for me. I want to save my connection settings in app config, that's fine, I'll click next. I want to go ahead and still use the most recent version of Entity Framework, so 6. Whatever, click next. And notice it can auto-sense everything in that database now. So what table do you want? Okay, well I want to use my DBO schema, and I want to use the users table within that DBO schema. It also shows me the views and stored procedures, which I do not have any currently in that database. I'm going to leave everything else the same, so I'm going to import my users table and click finish. And then it should create my EDMX, or my entity data model, inside my instance of Visual Studio. Sometimes it takes a second. There it goes. So now it shows you exactly what it looks like within your Visual Studio. So you have your ID, username, password, cancel date, basically the same thing you had over in SQL Server. If you go to data connections as well, you can see the same thing. Here's my users table. Kind of like we did for our database file, the same kind of thing. But now we're using Entity Framework to do all of this for us, to do all of that ADO.NET code for us. So notice here we have my EDMX and my desktop EDMX, or my entity data model. From there it shows you all of the entities you have in there, all of your plain old C# objects, which really we don't have much but that table right now. So desktop entities, and there's our users DB set here. Oops, I didn't mean to click that. So here's our users DB set here. And notice it makes all of this code is generated for us. So it's a DB set of user. So if I F12 into user, let's go to definition, it actually makes a user object for us to hold what was in our database. We didn't have to do any of this at all. Entity Framework generated it, and at the top it'll actually tell you that Entity Framework generated it. This code was generated from a template. Manual changes could cause unexpected behavior, so maybe Entity Framework will no longer see your entity, or maybe if you change the name of this property, it can no longer bind to it. So we don't really want to change anything in this file. So now, what we can do is let's go and hit a button. Let's put a button on our form. So let's go to our toolbox, Windows Forms, button. So button 1. So here's our Windows form now. So form 1, I should probably rename it to maybe users, user main form or something like that. Yes. So now it's renamed to user main form. On my button 1 click, the first thing I'm going to do is make a new user DB proxy. Let's go ahead and make that private. Call it DB desktop proxy, and then here maybe my initialized components. I can go ahead and say my desktop proxy equals new user db proxy. So this is where I'm going to try to get all of my information from my database. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that away in my initialized component so it runs whenever the form runs, whenever the form news up. I should probably also rename this. I'm going to go ahead and delete this actually and give it a useful name. Let's go ahead and build my project. It'll fail. So I'll get rid of this as well. Let's go back to my form and give it a good name. What don't you like? I just got rid of it. Let's build again. Alright, build succeeded, so this should work now. Could not find type user db proxy. You should be able to see it. Okay, there it went. Just took a second apparently. Alright, let's rename this to get users, or btn get users. The text property, I would like to call it get users. Alright. Let's double click it again. Alright, now it has a better name. So now that I have a proxy to my database, let's say db proxy dot get all users. So there's not currently anything to do that, so let's go ahead and generate a method to do it for us. So I'm going to go to the definition now. And then here, I'm going to say user, So now this needs to call my user data access object. So now I can say, let's make this public. I want to say user DAO, and it's not going to find it because it's in another project. So I'm going to need a reference to that project. So user DAO equals new. That's fine. And it can't find it right now. If we control period, it should tell us, would you like to add a reference to your database project? So we can kind of see our database project, and yeah, I want to add a reference to it. And then if we go to references over here on the right, we'll see that we actually now have a reference to our other database project. Okay, so now I want to be able to do that in here. So user DAO dot get all users. So I'm going to go ahead and control period again. I want to generate another method in that project, or in that C# file, to also get the users. And what I want to actually do is return it, but we'll do that here in a second. So here's my user DAO, and now here's my get all users method that I just generated. So here, I actually want to return, I want to return an IEnumerable of user. The only thing that IEnumerable means is it's iterable. You can iterate through all of the users. It could be a list, an array, a collection of whatever of users. I want whoever is, this is a form of polymorphism. I want the user to be able to determine what they would like to use, what they want the users to be on their end. So from here, I'm going to say using. I'm going to have a using statement. And what I want to use is my desktop entity data model. So I actually need to figure out what I called it again. Is that in here? No. What is the name of my desktop? Maybe it is desktop entities. Desktop, there it is, desktop entities. So now this is my key to my database, or these desktop entities. And I'm using this using statement because this allows me to garbage collect my connection to my database as soon as it hits this curly brace. So a using statement, much different from this sort of using statement, but this using statement with the curly braces news up an implementation of our desktop entities, and once it hits this, it automatically doesn't wait for the garbage collector to collect it. It forces the garbage collector to collect it right when it hits this part here. So it closes that connection right when we're finished with it. So it doesn't leave it open for us. And what I want to do is I want to say desktop.users. So we have this users, and if we go to, I believe here, no, users, so it generates so many files. Was it here, desktop entities? Right here. So if we have this users, which is our DB set of users, so it goes into our table and it grabs all the users for us. So whenever I say .users from our desktop entities, it uses that DB context and reaches out to our table and grabs all of our users. So now let's go back to our user DAO. And what I actually want to do is return all of them. I want to return my users. And notice this is a DB set of user. Let's leave it like that and see if it likes that. So whenever I call get all users, it'll reach out to the table and return every single user in that table. So I can actually modify it to maybe only return a few users using link or something like that, but I'm just going to leave it right now to return all of the users. And actually what I'm going to use this proxy to do is, instead of returning the database of users, I'm going to actually return only the information from my users that I want. Excuse me. So here's my user DB proxy, and I'm going to make a new class here. I'm going to add a new folder called entities, and in that folder I'm going to create a new C# class called user.cs. So this is now my own user in my application and not a user generated by my SQL server. So I'm going to go ahead and make a property string username, and then maybe another property. It's a date time, cancel date. So I don't necessarily want the user's password, because I'm not going to display that. I just want to know the username and whether or not they are currently a user on my application. So what I can do in my service layer now, my user DAO, let's actually reformat this a little bit as well. Let's create a constructor. So I went ahead and control-clicked on here and told it to create a constructor for me. And I'm going to say this. Okay. So whenever they new one up, then I'll new up my data access object class. So here I want it to be an IEnumerable, again, of user. But now this user, I don't want it to be from my database. This user, I want it to be this user here. So it is kind of confusing. I could rename this so I wouldn't be getting this error. This wants me to use my collections framework, but I actually want to use what's in my entities. So I wanted to do entities.user. And now notice instead of being from my database, now it's using my entities folder in my project and that user. So now if I go to the definition of this, now it's the one I made instead of the one that SQL made for me. And now it doesn't like that because not all code paths return a value, so I need to return that, get all users. And now it can't convert because now it's trying to convert from my SQL users to my entity user. So the two different classes. So what I want to actually do now is I'm going to use link to create a new object for me. So let's go up here using link, system.link, and now it notices that I can now do a select statement because this implements IEnumerable. This will make a little bit more sense when we cover link. But now I want to project this into my own user object from the object I have here. So now notice this is the user. It doesn't tell you, but this is actually the user from our database because that's what getAllUsers is. I'm going to say make a new entities user object from that. And then I'm going to say my username is equal to x.username. So that's coming from my database. And the cancel date is equal to the cancel date coming from my database. But this is a nullable cancel date. So I should probably make this one nullable. Or I could say dot has value. So if the cancel date has a value, no, actually I'm just going to make the one here nullable. So let's go ahead, go to definition, date time. Let's go ahead and make this nullable. Now if I go back here, it should be fine with it now. So it's a nullable date time, so there need not be a conversion anymore because it's the same type. So what I could also do is I could also make another method called public IEnumerable of user again. I want it to be entity.user, entities.user. I want to get all active users to my website. So now I can do the same kind of projection here. But now I can say .where. I want to say where the x.cancel date equals null. So if the cancel date is null, I know that they're an active user on my website, but if the cancel date is populated with a date, I know that user canceled their subscription on a certain date, so they're no longer active. So I only want to get the users where the cancel date is null. And then that's when I'm going to project that into a new user type. So now I also have this kind of logic here, and it's duplicated. So what I'm going to do is instead make a method called, make a private method that returns entities.user project to user type, and it's going to take in the user from the database. So instead of this, I'm going to say let's go ahead and do I want to cut this much? Let's cut that. I want to say project to user type. And now my project to user type, I'm going to say return new entities.user. So notice select can also take in a method that returns something. So it can also take in a func, which is essentially a method that can return something. I'm going to send it the database user, and I want it to return my entities.user. So now I can also get rid of this code, and I want to select project to user type. And now notice it says each time I'm going to send it one of the users, I'm going to figure out what to do with it, and then I'm going to send you back just that one user. And I'm going to go through it until I've run out of users to do that with. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and exit full screen. Let's put another button here as well. I want to call this button get only active users. btn get active users. Let's make it a little bigger here. I don't really have a UI for it, but you can imagine how I could have buttons or something on here, or a text field that would display all of them, but I'm just going to set a breakpoint to show that it works. So I'm going to here call the desktop proxy dot get only my active users. I'm going to go ahead and put that in a variable. Active users equals and var users equals. Okay, so now we're going to show how Entity Framework we can go out and connect. So I'm going to set a breakpoint here and a breakpoint here, start my application. So let's click Get All Users. It's going to come into our click event here. Okay, let's F11 into this. What is null? Why is my desktop proxy null? I definitely set it to something. Did it never go through initialize components? Let's set a breakpoint here. Okay, that's F11. Where did I put it? I swore I put it here. Why is it not here anymore? Alright. That's why you never do it live. Alright, let's go back to initialize components and put it there again. I swear I copied it. Where'd it go? Proxy, UDMX. Initialize initialize components equals new proxy to our service layer. Okay, let's try that again. Let's get users. Let's F10, let's F11. Alright, so we don't get a null reference exception anymore. I want to get all users and project it to my user type. So it's going to then reach out to my layer here where it gets all the users. So notice this doesn't have a lot of logic here. All I do is just go to my table and get the users. I believe if I go to SQL Server, okay, so this is an active user. So let's make another user that's not active any longer. Let's make the cancel date. This is a date time, so I need to be careful how I do it. Maybe 2019. Alright, so yeah, there we go. So this one has a cancel date now. So let's go back and continue on through our logic here. It's going to return. And now my users. Doesn't look like it returned anything. It yielded no results. Not what I expected. Let's see if I need to project it to a list first. I was wondering if I needed to do that before. Let's see if that maybe is the issue. Let's run it again. Let's get my users. I'm getting all of the users. No connection string named desktop entities. That's so weird. Alright. Well, I wonder what is wrong with the connection string. Okay, I think my connection string from here actually needs to be in my other app config. So let's actually take configuration config section, so that actually shows that there's an entity framework section. So let's take all of this and put it in the main app config over here. So essentially this entity framework demo is running, but it didn't have any of this information that it needed to actually connect to the database. So let's see if it works better now. I'm surprised I didn't get that exception before. It probably because I didn't have the to list on there. Okay. Let's go ahead and see if we actually get users now. No. Only one config section element allowed in config file. So something happened when I copy and pasted it over it didn't like. And if present must be the first child of the root configuration element, so I bet that's the actual issue. So it doesn't like that it's not the first thing under here. Startup is the first thing, so let's get rid of startup. And let's try to move startup to the bottom, see if it likes that better. No. Entity framework. Alright, I'm going to pause the video and try to figure this one out. It might take a second. Okay, I'm back. So, I was able to fix it. Well, the issue was, if we come here to references, the database project references Entity Framework and Entity Framework SQL Server. So I actually had to go into the project files and make sure that this project also has those same references to Entity Framework and Entity Framework SQL Server. So if we go over to the project files, what I did was I copied this reference from here, and then I went ahead and pasted it over into here. So now both of those have access to Entity Framework. So I want to go ahead and close out of this. So now if we start and click Get All Users, it's actually going to reach out to our database. It was able to gather a connection this time. I didn't get an error. And if I come back, now if I hover over users, I get both of my users back. So the cancel date for this user is null. The username was my UC email address. And then my other user has a cancel date for my other Gmail email address. So now I want to go ahead and F10. If I get only active users, it should only return back one record where the cancel date is null. So notice I reached out to those tables. I didn't have to do any sort of ADO.NET. I didn't have to do any SQL select statements. It simply came over here to my user DAO and reached out to my users table from my EDMX. So I'm going to go ahead and close this down and go to my EDMX over here on the right hand side. Reached out to my users table and did this. So now you can see how powerful this can be to use link and use our data tables to get information from our tables. So if you load in multiple tables, it'll also show relationships and be able to build our C# objects from those relationships. Notice I didn't have to build any C# objects to do this other than just my classes to get the information from my tables. So next week we'll cover Entity Framework and how we're going to use Entity Framework to insert users into our table and do that with maybe a stored procedure or something like that. So we'll create a stored procedure next week in the module, and then we'll start inserting using Entity Framework instead of our ADO statements like we used last week. So I hope this video was helpful. Reach out with any questions or concerns you might have, and then make sure you work on the next assignment. So feel free to reach out and have a good week. Thanks.